Hi everyone, welcome to another video on using Excel. This will be an introduction to the common summation formulas in Excel. While Excel has a number of summation formulas, today we'll be looking at the three most common and relevant functions. Let's begin with the simplest version of the summation functions. We already have some mock-up data, so let's begin with the simplest version of this. If you look at column B, here we have a list of numbers and we want to add them up. So the sum function helps you add numbers in a given range. This is a very simple common formula that everyone is aware of. So if you just type in sum, you select the range, it will give you the sum for that range of numbers. Now let's move on to something more involved. So let's say we want, in example 2, let's say we want to add the salary of all those people whose role is that of a processor. So how do we accomplish that? So one way that we can accomplish that is the old-fashioned way, which is we can simply select the cells one at a time, and we can add them up. So in this example, we are simply selecting the cells which qualify as per our criteria, which is we want to add up the salary of all the processors. We add it up one by one, and that will give us the answer that we require. However, as stated before in other videos as well, whenever you're trying to solve a problem with any set of data, remember that what you have been given to solve might be just a few lines. But then if you're faced with much larger data, say for example 300 lines of data or 2000 rows of data, then this method is definitely not going to be practical. It will be too time consuming and too difficult. So then how do we go about doing this? So here we can use something known as Sumif. Now Sumif is a version of sum which adds certain cells provided some criteria is qualified. Now the good part is that the criteria does not necessarily need to belong to the same set of cells that you're trying to add. In other words, the criteria does not need to belong to the column for salary. So let's see how this works. So starting off with the formal definition of Sumif. So there are three parameters that this function takes. The first parameter is range. Range is those set of cells on which the criteria would be applied. The second parameter is criteria, which is nothing but the qualifying condition basis which the sum formula would work. And sum range is the range of cells that you want to add. So in this case, when we apply our cells to this problem, we see that the range in this case is processor. So let's go ahead and select that. Now, what is the criteria? Now, the criteria in this case is we want to find out the sum of the salary of all of those employees who are processors. So let's go ahead and put that criteria in. And then finally, we have to select the range that we want to add, or the range from which we want to add. So that range is salary. So let's select that range and let's see what do we get. There we are. We have the sum of the salaries of all those employees whose role is processor. Okay, let's move on to the next example. Now, this is a more expanded version of Sumif. In this version, what we look at is when there are multiple criteria involved, how does Excel help adding up numbers? So in this case, the formula we will use is Sumifs. And the problem that we're trying to solve under example 3 is, let's say we want to add the salary of all those employees whose role is processor and whose tenure is equal to 3 years. Immediately you can spot the fact that unlike example 2, in which all that we were concerned with is that the role is processor, here we have two qualifying condition or criteria in order to add the numbers. First criteria is that the role is processor, and the second is the tenure should be equal to 3 years. So let's see the formal definition. So the parameters that we have here are slightly different from the one that we just saw for Sumif. The first parameter here is sum range. Sum range here is that range that you want to add. In this case, that range is salary. Remember that in Sumif, this range appeared right at the end of the formula. The next thing that we need to look at in terms of parameter is criteria range 1, which is what is the range of cells on which the first criteria would be applicable. So let's say the first criteria that we want to apply is that the role is that of processor. So we select the range. And then the next thing we want to do here is let's add the criteria. The criteria, similar to example 2, is that the role should be processor. And now for the second qualifying condition of this problem, which is the tenure of the employee has to be 3 years. So again, what is the range? The range in this case is going to be the tenure in column K. So we select that, and the qualifying condition is that it should be 3 years. There we are. Let's go ahead and add it up. All right, let's just conduct a quick check to make sure that we have the right answer. So let's manually look at all those employees whose role is processor and whose tenure is 3 years. So this is the first cell, and then the second one will not be applicable because the tenure is 8 years. Let's pick the next one, which matches our criteria, and then this one for Emma, row number 14, is not applicable because the tenure is 4, and then let's select this one, which is matching our criteria. The role is processor and the tenure is 3. All right, as you can see that the answer is correct as validated by the manual method. Now, a number which very closely comes up in relation to sum is the concept of an average. Average is also often referred to as mean. In the average, what we're looking at is the sum of a set of numbers divided by the count of numbers. So whatever we have seen being applicable in terms of summation formulas is similarly applicable in terms of calculating an average. So let's take a look at that. So how is average calculated manually? So the way average is calculated manually is by adding up the set of the numbers that you have here and dividing it by the count. As you know, in Excel, when you select a range of numbers at the bottom of the screen, it generally tells you the sum, the count, and the average. So we can see that the sum of this range is 205, the count of the number of cells is 13, and the average is 15.76. So let's use the average formula. Calculate and see if it matches the numbers mentioned. There we are. As you can see, it is the same average as we had seen on the screen before. Just for reference, you can now compare. At the bottom of the screen, it says 15.76, and that is what we have as the answer here. Now, an extension of the simple average formula will be looking at a set of numbers and calculating an average when subjected to a certain condition. This closely rivals what we saw in terms of Sumif. So let's go ahead and try this extended version. So we have a Sumif. So we have an Averageif. Averageif works roughly the same way. The first thing it wants is the range. Now the range here is going to be the range on which criteria is applicable. That range is in column E for role. The condition that we have here is going to be processor, and apart from that, the last thing we have to mention here is the range of cells that you want to calculate the average of, which is in column F. And there we are. It's just calculated the average. The average of the salary of all the employees whose role is processor is computed here. Finally, moving on to a more expanded version. So let's say you want to calculate an average of a set of numbers subjected to more than one condition. So how do we accomplish that? This works in the same way as we saw for Sumifs. So in this case, the formula that we have is Averageifs. Remember, there's a slight change again as compared to Averageif. So you don't specify the range first. You specify the average range. In other words, that set of cells for which you want to calculate the average, which in this case is going to be salary. The next thing that we have to specify on the list of parameters is going to be the criteria range, which will be for role. And let's mention the criteria we're looking for, which is processor. And finally, let's say the second criteria is going to be tenure. So we select that range and we mention the qualifying condition, which is the tenure should be 3 years. So as you can see that this works almost exactly the same way in which Sumif and Sumifs or Sumifs works. So all these formulas are heavily used and extremely useful when it comes to calculating or doing summation for a set of numbers. So that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you for watching. See you next time.